After a church is incorporated and established, it then needs organizational rules or processes by which to fulfill its stated goals. It may wish to proclaim the gospel, to serve its neighbors in love, to have the best Sunday afternoon dinners in all the land. To achieve these and other goals, there needs to be a structure and process by which they are carried out. And the rules by which a church operates to accomplish its mission are put forth in its governing documents. Now, when most people hear about governing documents, they sigh a little bit inside, because they're usually lengthy, wordy, dry, cumbersome rules that tire and even annoy a little bit, especially if there are members in the congregation who are real sticklers for the rules. These governing documents are your best friend. Well, maybe your second best friend. But they are there to help you. And when properly understood and utilized, they are effective tools in clarifying the mission of the congregation, in coming to fair and good decisions as a church, and in guiding congregations forward efficiently and in unity to achieve its goals together. Now, the governing documents of a congregation are those documents that contain the structure and the processes that govern the life of the church. They can generally be understood in three categories or layers: the charter, the bylaws, and the manuals, each preceding the others in importance. For most churches and organizations and businesses, the charter is the Articles of Incorporation. This document was discussed in some detail in a previous video on formative documents. Alternatively, a church may be granted a charter by its parent denomination, and though not incorporated with the state, its foundational document may be this denominational charter. A church's articles, however, bring it into existence by incorporating it with the state. It posits such basic information as the name, location, purpose, and limitations of its activities. As it is the official document establishing the church, it is the preeminent governing document of the congregation, and its bylaws and manuals cannot contradict it. This is the main basic document establishing the congregation, and as such, it is very difficult to change, requiring either an amendment with the state or approval from a church's governing denomination. The second category of governing documents is the bylaws. This is spelled in various ways, but they all refer to the same document, and they contain the principles and the rules which govern the congregation in its most essential matters. They are typically quite a bit lengthier and more detailed than the articles. And while some churches include their bylaws in their articles, it's usually best that they remain separate documents, as we'll soon see. Churches' bylaws vary in detail across denominations, and for that reason it's good to be familiar with your own church's particular bylaws. However, nearly all churches' bylaws contain such things as its name, its location, its stated purpose. And while these are typically also included in a church's charter or Articles of Incorporation, they may be expanded upon here, though not contradicting the Articles of Incorporation. Bylaws also commonly include chapters on denominational membership, the body or denomination to which a congregation belongs, and it may specify that relationship. It will commonly include a statement of faith, the basic tenets held by a congregation. This typically includes such basic beliefs pertaining to the Scriptures, the person and work of Jesus, salvation, and perhaps also states the creeds to which a congregation adheres. And furthermore, the bylaws contain the provisions by which a congregation is internally organized. It describes such things as the membership. What are their qualifications? What are their rights and responsibilities? Various levels of membership. how members are received into or transferred out of a congregation. And while there is today a trend away from emphasis on formal membership, it is still important, practically and legally, to define who is responsible for the decisions and actions of a congregation. It includes information on the ministers, the pastors, priests, deacons, and preachers that serve a congregation. It may specify from where they are called, what is the process by which they come to a congregation, what are their responsibilities, what is their relationship to the leadership of the congregation, how they may leave from a congregation, and how a congregation ought to operate in the absence of a minister. The bylaws specifies a board of directors, variously known as a council, vestry, session, and so forth. It describes how the members of the leadership board are elected, their expected qualifications, the length of their terms, and what happens in the event of an absence. The bylaws as well specify the same for a church's officers, and a following video will cover the board, the congregation, and its officers in greater detail. The bylaws contain information on the meetings of the congregation, the tasks that are to be accomplished each year, quarter, or month. It specifies the notification needed, the quorum required, and describes the process by which actions are taken. And church bylaws commonly contain additional provisions relating to committees, dissolution of the congregation, indemnification, amendments to the bylaws, discipline or removal of pastors, officers, and members of the congregation. And the rules specified in the bylaws lay out the most basic organization of the church and contain the processes by which a church conducts its most basic business. And again, it's good to have these for a written down, agreed upon process regarding the most fundamental aspects of the congregation lead to better unity, a greater sense of fairness, more clarity, and altogether more robust purpose and process for leading the congregation. Because of their importance, ministers and leadership, and members too, should know them, for familiarity with the bylaws can save a lot of time, of frustration, and of unnecessary conflict. If people are aware of the principles and the processes contained in the bylaws that have already been agreed upon. To this point, I've referred to the bylaws as the governing document of a congregation. But what about a constitution? How does a constitution relate to the bylaws? In most cases, the constitution is the same document as the bylaws, simply going by another name. However, some denominations have both a constitution and bylaws to govern their congregations. If this is the case, a constitution generally includes the most basic principles of a congregation, and the bylaws elaborate on the processes by which they are carried out. The intention of having two documents in such an arrangement is that one, the Constitution, is more difficult to amend than the other, the bylaws. When both exist, the Constitution has priority over the bylaws. That is, the bylaws cannot contradict it. This is a way of separating the rules of the congregation into two discrete documents with varying levels of notice, quorum, and agreement needed to amend. While some churches have this twofold structure to the bylaws, the general trend has been to move towards a single instrument to govern a congregation. Two documents can result in repetition, inconsistency, or unnecessary complexity in governing a congregation. And for the most part, it's more efficient to have all the governing principles of a congregation contained in a single document. However, what if a church doesn't have bylaws? Well, in that case, many denominations provide model bylaws for a congregation. Usually, in this case, a denomination reviews and approves any proposed changes. And please consult with your denominational body if wishing as a congregation to amend your governing documents in any way. But what if even then you don't have bylaws? Well, you still may be bound by some particular rules. Every church, organization, or business exists within a network of local, state, and federal laws. While most states require churches to have bylaws, 35 out of the 50 do so. Regardless, all states specify specific provisions that have to be met by a congregation. This is because all organizations must have some generally accepted rules to govern their activities. And there has to be accountability and record of how decisions are made, in the case of filing taxes, acquiring property, legal disputes, and so forth. Closely related to the bylaws is a book of parliamentary procedure known as the Rules of Order. These govern how the meetings themselves, of the congregation, of the board, and of committees, are led and governed. The order of meetings, how information is presented, how motions are made, discussed, and voted upon, and other questions about the meetings themselves are described in these Rules of Order. Most churches specify in their bylaws which rules of order will govern their meetings, the most widely accepted being Robert's Rules of Order, the most recent edition. Robert's Rules of Order are generally used at meetings of all kinds today, and even if your church's meetings are rather informal, it is still beneficial to be aware of these Rules of Order, and these Rules of Order become even more important at meetings of greater size and formality, such as the convening of a denominational body. And I'll likewise cover these Rules of Order in more detail in a video to follow. Also related to the Rules of Order are the standing rules. These are formally adopted rules relating to the administrative support of a church's meetings. They may specify such things as when a body will meet, who will keep minutes in the event that a secretary is absent, who will introduce guests and at what point this will happen in the meeting, who will bring the coffee, who will bring the pastries, who will bring the casserole, the potato salad, the kebabs, and so forth. These standing rules, though not necessarily written down, can answer minor administrative details that make meetings more efficient and enjoyable for its members. And lastly, related to the bylaws are resolutions. Resolutions may be statements of policy or position that are held by the congregation. They may also specify in greater detail areas not covered in the bylaws. Like the standing rules, a church's resolutions may be recorded and maintained apart from its bylaws. And the third and last category of governing documents are the manuals. Like bylaws, churches will usually adopt manuals to help in the governance of a congregation. They are even more specific and flexible than the bylaws, and relate to the particular areas of a congregation, describing the processes by which they operate. For instance, a church could have an employment manual, describing the process by which employees are recruited, interviewed, and hired. There may likewise be employee manuals for the various positions of a congregation. There may be manuals on preparation for worship, on home visitation, on how various ministries of a congregation are conducted. Manuals put forth the information that guide the specific areas of a church's life, enhancing common understanding, ease of ministry, continuity, and clarity when questions arise. Manuals are usually comparatively easy to adopt and amend, and therefore are the most informal yet nonetheless binding governing documents of a congregation. The manuals are the closest to the ground, and while the bylaws may be most evident at official meetings of the congregation, it is the manuals that contain the actual nuts and bolts of how a congregation's activities are lived out day to day. And if congregations do not have manuals for various aspects of its ministry, they may be worth developing, as they do bring clarity, unity, and continuity to the various areas of a congregation's life. And so these three categories of governing documents, the charter, the bylaws, and the manuals, work together to govern a congregation and its ministry. And when properly appreciated, understood, and utilized, they can be powerful instruments in leading the life of a congregation. So thank you for joining with us in this review on governing documents of a congregation, and may God bless you today.